In February 1943, the sky over central Tunisia was already crowded when one American heavy bomber began to fall behind, its engine straining, its formation slipping, its margins shrinking by the second. And in that narrowing space between survival and loss, the flight that would later be remembered as the one that continued after everything went wrong was beginning its longest hour. Because this was not a training field or a test range, but the air corridor between the Allied bases in North Africa and the Axis port facilities that fed German and Italian forces fighting for control of Tunisia. And the aircraft was a B-17F Flying Fortress of the United States Army Air Forces, assigned to the 97th Bomb Group of the 12th Air Force, part of the first American heavy bomber units to operate against German targets in the Mediterranean, flying from dusty airfields carved out of the desert where maintenance was improvised, intelligence incomplete, and experience paid for and aircraft lost. And on this morning, the mission was routine only in name. A daylight bombing attack against the port of Bizerte, a heavily defended harbor whose docks, warehouses, and shipping lanes were protected by layered anti-aircraft guns and some of the most aggressive Luftwaffe fighter units then operating in North Africa, including veteran pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Men who had learned over Malta and Tobruk how to tear into bomber formations. And the Americans knew this, because by February 1943, they had already lost aircraft on nearly every deep penetration mission, sometimes to flak, sometimes to fighters, often to both. And yet the pressure to keep flying was relentless, because the ground war depended on cutting access supply lines. And so, on this morning, the B-17s assembled, climbed, and formed up. 4 Wright Cyclone engines on each aircraft beating the air into a steady rhythm, the bomb bays loaded, the crew strapped in, oxygen masks ready, gunners scanning an empty sky that would not remain empty for long, and the aircraft that would later be nicknamed All-American took its place in the formation. Outwardly no different from the others, its olive drab paint dulled by dust and sun, its crew trained, alert, and focused on staying in position. Because in 1943, formation discipline was survival, the overlapping fields of fire from the 50 caliber machine guns forming a moving fortress in the sky, strong only as long as it remained intact. And as the bombers crossed the coastline and pushed inland toward their target, the weather was clear enough to invite interception, and it came as expected, not all at once, but in waves. German fighters climbing to altitude, then diving through the formation, firing, breaking away, circling back. And in one of those passes, in a moment measured not in minutes, but in fractions of a second, everything went wrong. Because in the confusion of combat, with aircraft maneuvering to avoid collisions while maintaining formation, a German fighter struck the B-17, not from outside, but from within the bomber stream itself, slicing through the air at closing speed. Its wing colliding with the flying fortress near the rear fuselage, a violent impact that tore metal, shattered structure, and instantly transformed a mission into a crisis. Because the B-17 did not simply lose a control surface or take a few holes, it lost a large section of its tail, the vertical stabilizer nearly severed, the horizontal stabilizer badly damaged, the fuselage ripped open along the right side, exposing internal structure and leaving part of the aircraft hanging in the slipstream. And in that instant, the bomber should have entered an unrecoverable spin, because the tail of a B-17 was not decorative. It was essential, providing stability, control, and balance, and without it, the laws of aerodynamics were unforgiving. Yet the aircraft did not immediately break apart. It lurched, it yawed, it shuddered, but it remained airborne, and that fact alone defied expectation, because the collision had done what enemy fire often could not. It had compromised the fundamental integrity of the aircraft, and now the crew was faced with a reality they had trained for only in theory, because no checklist existed for flying a heavy bomber with a missing tail section deep over enemy territory, under attack with engines still running but stability uncertain. And the first seconds after the collision were about control, because the pilot fought the controls, countering a tendency to yaw and roll, using engine power asymmetrically, trimming constantly, discovering through feel rather than calculation what the aircraft would tolerate, while the co-pilot assisted, monitoring instruments, calling out airspeed and altitude. And behind them, the crew assessed damage and fragments, because there was no single vantage point from which to understand how close they were to destruction. The tail gunner seeing daylight where metal had been, the waist gunners feeling the cold air rush through torn skin, the engineer scanning gauges to ensure engines were still delivering power, the radio operator checking that communication lines were intact, and the navigator and bombardier realizing that their planned path to the target might now be irrelevant because survival itself had become the mission. And yet, the bomber was still in formation, barely, lagging slightly, its wounds visible, and German fighters noticed immediately because damaged aircraft were priority targets, easier kills. And as the B-17 struggled to maintain position, additional attacks followed, machine gun fire and cannon shells striking the fuselage, ripping through aluminum, punching holes that were now almost redundant because the aircraft was already open to the sky. And the defensive guns continued to fire because stopping meant inviting destruction. And in that exchange, the reality of American daylight bombing doctrine was laid bare because it depended on aircraft staying together. But here was one that could not, and slowly, inevitably, the damaged bomber fell behind, slipping out of the protective envelope of overlapping fire, becoming isolated. And at that moment, the decision confronting the crew was stark but unspoken, because they could attempt to turn back immediately, hoping the aircraft would remain controllable long enough to reach friendly territory, or they could press on with the formation toward the target, maintaining altitude and heading as long as possible, because abrupt maneuvers might overstress the remaining structure and cause catastrophic failure. And in February 1943, the guidance given to bomber crews emphasized maintaining formation and completing the mission when feasible, not as bravado but as a calculation, because lone aircraft were more vulnerable than damaged ones that stayed near the group. And so the pilot held course, accepting the instability, trusting the airframe to hold together for just a little longer, and the B-17 continued toward Bizerte, its bomb bay doors still closed, its load still aboard, even as the Luftwaffe regrouped for further attacks, because the presence of a crippled bomber was an opportunity, and the German pilots pressed it, attacking from the rear quarter where the tail guns were compromised, forcing the remaining gunners to cover arcs that had never been intended to be exposed. And through all of this, the aircraft remained airborne, a fact that would later be attributed to the inherent strength of the B-17's design, its redundant systems, its thick wing spars, its ability to absorb punishment. But in the moment, it felt less like engineering and more like chance, because the bomber's behavior was unpredictable, responding differently to control inputs, requiring constant adjustment, the pilot unable to relax even briefly, because any lapse could allow the aircraft to depart controlled flight. And as they neared the target area, flak began to rise, black bursts blossoming around the formation, and now the damaged aircraft faced another layer of danger because anti-aircraft fire did not discriminate between intact and crippled, and the violent concussions further stressed an already wounded structure. And yet, the bomber remained with the group long enough to reach the bomb run, because turning away earlier would have required a maneuver that might have been fatal. And so when the lead aircraft released, the damaged B-17 released as well, its bombs falling toward the docks and installations below. The mission objective met even as the aircraft itself was barely holding together. And once the bomb bay was empty, the weight reduction altered the aircraft's balance again, changing its handling characteristics, forcing the pilot to relearn how it flew in real time, because every change in mass distribution mattered now. And only after the formation turned away from the target did the damaged bomber finally break off, unable to maintain speed or position any longer. And at that point, the flight truly became solitary, because the distance to friendly territory was still significant, the sea still ahead, enemy fighters still in the area, and the aircraft's condition deteriorating with every mile. Because the torn fuselage created drag, the damaged tail reduced stability, and the stress fractures propagated as air loads shifted, and yet the engines kept running, the airspeed remained just above stall, and the pilot nursed the aircraft along, choosing altitude and heading carefully, avoiding sharp turns, because everything about the situation argued that they should already have been gone, and this was the core tension of the moment, not a sudden crisis, but a sustained one, stretching time, turning minutes into something heavier, because there was no dramatic explosion, no single decision that resolved it, only a continuous series of small adjustments, checks, and judgments, each one critical, each one made with incomplete information, and as they crossed back toward the coastline, the German fighters made another pass, because the lone bomber was still there, still visible, still a target, and defensive fire drove them off again. But ammunition was finite, fatigue setting in, and the crew understood that even if they survived the enemy, the aircraft itself might fail before reaching safety, because the Mediterranean lay ahead, and ditching a heavy bomber with a compromised tail was not a reassuring prospect. And it was here, with the African coastline receding behind them and open water ahead, that the reality of what they were attempting fully asserted itself, because the aircraft had already exceeded what any manual would have predicted, and the margin for error was gone. And yet, the B-17 continued, engines droning, controls heavy, structure vibrating, carrying its crew away from the target area, but not yet towards certainty, because the distance to base was still measured in long, vulnerable miles, and the question was no longer whether everything had gone wrong, because it had, but whether the aircraft could continue long enough for that wrongness to end somewhere survivable. And as the pilot held the bomber steady over the sea, watching airspeed and horizon with unbroken concentration, the flight entered the most dangerous stretch of all, alone, damaged, and far from land, with the outcome still completely uncertain. With the coastline fading behind them and the Mediterranean stretching forward in every direction, the damaged B-17 entered a phase of the flight where no outside force was required to end it, because the aircraft itself had become the primary threat, its structural wounds interacting with airspeed, vibration, and gravity in ways no one aboard could fully predict. And the pilot understood that over water there would be no forced landing option that resembled a landing at all, only a controlled impact if control could be maintained, or an uncontrolled one if it could not. And so the aircraft was held at a carefully judged speed, slow enough to reduce stress on the damaged tail, but fast enough to avoid stall. A narrow band that demanded constant attention, because any fluctuation in engine output or turbulence could push them outside it. And the engines themselves, though still running, were not equal, their power output varying slightly, requiring continual throttle adjustments to counter yaw, because the missing stabilizing surfaces meant that asymmetric thrust now had an exaggerated effect. And the engineer watched oil pressure and temperatures closely, knowing that an engine failure now would almost certainly be unrecoverable. And in the open fuselage, the wind roared, cold and relentless, tearing at loose equipment, making communication difficult even through intercom. And the crew moved as little as possible, because shifting weight altered balance, and balance was already precarious. And this restraint extended even to routine tasks, because nothing about the aircraft could be taken for granted. And as minutes passed, the initial adrenaline of combat gave way to a slower, heavier strain, because the crisis was not resolving, it was simply continuing, and the human factor began to matter as much as the mechanical, because fatigue dulled reaction times, and fear, though controlled, was ever present, a quiet awareness that survival depended on things remaining just as they were, despite the fact that they were already badly wrong. And it was during this stretch that the crew began to fully assess what had happened to their aircraft, because with no immediate enemy in sight, there was time to look. And what they saw was not reassuring, because the tail section was partially torn away, the remaining structure twisted, control cables exposed, and the fuselage skin peeled back along the right side like a wound that could not close. And the tail gunner's position was compromised, his ability to traverse limited, his protection reduced. And yet he remained at his post, scanning the sky, because isolation did not mean safety, and German fighters were known to pursue damaged bombers far from the target area. And although none appeared immediately, the absence of threat was itself unsettling, because it allowed imagination to fill the space, and the navigator worked continuously, recalculating heading and distance. Because the planned route back assumed intact performance, and now drift and wind had greater effect, and fuel consumption was harder to predict, because throttle settings were constantly adjusted, and the margin of fuel that had seemed adequate on takeoff now felt thin. because any detour, any delay, could turn endurance into a problem. And the decision-making burden rested primarily on the pilot, because every choice was immediate and irreversible, whether to climb or descend, whether to adjust speed, whether to alter course slightly to avoid weather or maintain heading. And all of these decisions were made without reference to precedent, because few aircraft had survived this kind of damage long enough to generate lessons. And so the pilot relied on feel, on training, and on a disciplined refusal to overcorrect, knowing that abrupt control inputs could induce oscillations the damaged tail could not dampen. And as they continued, the sea below remained deceptively calm, offering no indication of the danger it represented. And time stretched because the aircraft's ground speed was reduced and the distance to friendly territory closed slowly. And it was in this prolonged vulnerability that the meaning of endurance shifted, because endurance was no longer about the aircraft's range or the crew's stamina alone. It was about the persistence of a fragile equilibrium, a balance that could be upset by something as small as a gust or a mechanical hiccup. And the crew monitored everything, listening to the engines for changes in tone, feeling vibrations through the airframe, watching the horizon for any sign of loss of control. And the pilot maintained constant pressure on the controls, because releasing them even briefly caused the aircraft to drift off attitude. And this continuous effort took a physical toll, muscles tightening, focus narrowing, because there was no autopilot solution for this condition, and the aircraft demanded a human presence every second. And then, as if to confirm that the ordeal was not yet finished, distant shapes appeared on the horizon, aircraft approaching, and the crew prepared for another engagement, because they could not outrun or outmaneuver fighters, and their only defense were their remaining guns and the hope that the enemy would misjudge their vulnerability. And as the aircraft closed, the silhouettes resolved into German fighters, their approach deliberate, because the lone bomber was an obvious target, and the gunners opened fire as soon as they were in range, conserving ammunition but making it clear that the aircraft was still dangerous. And the fighters made probing passes, firing, breaking away, testing reactions, and each pass forced the pilot to hold steady despite instinct. Because evasive maneuvers were limited to slight adjustments, and the aircraft absorbed more hits, holes appearing where holes already existed. And still, it flew, because the critical components remained intact, and the fighters eventually disengaged, perhaps deterred by defensive fire or concerned about fuel or the presence of Allied fighters elsewhere. And when they left, the sense of relief was muted, because nothing fundamental had improved, and the crew knew that the most difficult part might still be ahead, because the aircraft had to land, and landing a B-17 was a complex procedure even when intact, requiring precise airspeed, alignment, and control, and with a compromised tail, the risks multiplied, because directional control on approach and rollout depended heavily on tail surfaces, and the ground loop or loss of control on touchdown could be fatal. And so as the aircraft continued toward its base, the crew began to consider the landing long before it was visible, discussing options in clipped, practical terms, because discussion itself had to be limited to essential information, and the navigator confirmed that their heading was correct, that fuel was still sufficient, that they were closing on friendly territory, and gradually the distant coastline appeared. A thin line that represented not safety, but possibility, because reaching land did not guarantee survival, but it allowed for choices that open water did not. And as they approached, the pilot began a gradual descent, because altitude was now a liability, as any loss of control would result in a longer fall. And the descent had to be shallow, because steep changes altered airflow over the damaged structure, and the aircraft responded sluggishly, lagging behind control inputs, requiring anticipation rather than reaction. And as they crossed over land, the sense of isolation lessened slightly, because there was at least the knowledge that if control was lost, there was ground beneath them, not water. But this was a thin comfort, because the terrain was unforgiving and emergency landing fields were scarce, and the base itself was still some distance away. And as the aircraft descended further, the air grew rougher, thermals and low-level turbulence interacting with the damaged structure, and the pilot compensated constantly, maintaining a careful balance. Because oscillations increased at lower altitude and the aircraft's tendency to yaw became more pronounced, and the engineer adjusted engine power to help maintain directional control because rudder authority was limited, and the crew braced for the approach because a landing would require the most precise flying of the entire mission, and the base finally came into view, its runways etched into the landscape. And the pilot aligned the aircraft carefully, setting up a long straight-in approach because turns were dangerous, and the landing gear was lowered cautiously because extending it altered drag and balance, and the aircraft responded with a change in attitude that had to be corrected smoothly, and the crew monitored for any sign that the added stress would cause further structural failure. And as they stabilized on final approach, the airspeed was held slightly higher than normal because a stall with compromised control would be unrecoverable. And the runway grew larger in the windscreen, and the pilot focused entirely on keeping the aircraft aligned because crosswind correction was limited and any drift could result in loss of control on touchdown, and the aircraft crossed the threshold, descending slowly, and the pilot flared gently, touching down with care. And for a moment it seemed as though the ordeal might end there, but the landing roll introduced new forces because directional control on the ground relied on tail surfaces that were damaged, and the aircraft began to veer, and the pilot corrected with differential braking and engine power, fighting to keep the bomber straight, because a ground loop would tear the weakened structure apart, and the aircraft slowed, the runway rushing beneath, and finally it came to a stop, intact, upright, and silent except for the ticking of cooling engines. And in that moment, the flight that had continued after everything went wrong reached a pause, not an end, because the consequences of what had just occurred were still unfolding, and the realization of how close they had come settled over the crew as they looked back at the aircraft that had carried them home, its torn fuselage and missing tail section, a stark record of the forces it had endured. And the understanding that what they had experienced was not just a narrow escape, but a demonstration of the limits of both machine and human endurance. And even as ground crews approached, disbelief evident in their reactions, the larger implications of the flight were only beginning to register, because this was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of learning, loss, and adaptation that defined American air operations in 1943. And the question now was not simply how the aircraft had survived, but what this survival would mean for how future missions were flown, how damage was assessed, and how the risks of daylight bombing were understood. And as the crew climbed down from the aircraft, exhaustion replacing tension, the moment froze in time, not as a conclusion, but as a hinge, because the flight was over, but the story of what it revealed about the war in the air was only beginning to be understood. And the fragile boundary between survivability and destruction had been exposed in a way that could not be ignored, leaving the outcome of this experience hanging between relief and reckoning, with its full significance still unresolved. And that unresolved significance began to take shape almost immediately, because the survival of the aircraft did not end the danger so much as transform it, shifting the focus from airborne crisis to the consequences of having pushed an airframe, a crew, and a doctrine beyond their expected limits. And as maintenance personnel approached the B-17 on the runway, they did so cautiously, not out of ceremony, but out of concern that the aircraft might still fail structurally even at rest, because the damage was extensive enough that no one could be certain which components were still bearing load and which were no longer connected to anything meaningful. And the engines were shut down deliberately, one at a time, because a sudden change in vibration could have unpredictable effects, and only when the propellers wound down did the silence settle in fully, allowing the magnitude of what had occurred to register without the background roar that had dominated the last hours. And it was then that the visual reality of the damage became undeniable, because the tail section was visibly torn, the vertical stabilizer nearly gone, the horizontal stabilizer partially missing, and the fuselage ripped open along the right side so completely that internal frames, control cables, and even parts of the interior equipment were exposed. And ground crews who had seen combat damage before stopped and stared, because this was not the typical pattern of flak holes or localized impact. This was catastrophic structural loss, the kind that normally preceded an in-flight breakup. And the fact that the aircraft had not only stayed airborne but returned from a combat mission defied the expectations formed by months of experience. And this reaction mattered because the people assessing the aircraft were not casual observers, but mechanics, engineers, and officers whose judgments would shape how similar situations were handled in the future. And the crew, exhausted and physically drained, were guided away from the aircraft because even standing near it posed a risk until they could be stabilized. And only then did the debriefing begin, not as a formal ritual, but as an urgent process of information gathering, because what had happened raised questions that went beyond one mission. And the crew described the collision, the loss of control surfaces, the handling characteristics, the decisions made in the air, and the way the aircraft responded to every adjustment. And these details were recorded carefully because they were rare data points drawn from an event that few survived to describe. And as this information was collected, the broader operational context pressed in, because February 1943 was a period of intense pressure on American air forces in the Mediterranean, with heavy losses already sustained and questions being raised about tactics, formations, and the survivability of daylight bombing without adequate fighter escort. And this flight intersected directly with those questions because it demonstrated both the resilience of the B-17 and the fragility of the assumptions underpinning its use. And while the aircraft had survived, it had done so under conditions that could not be reliably replicated, relying on a combination of design strength, pilot skill, and circumstance. And this distinction was critical because planners needed to know whether survival was something that could be expected or something that should be considered exceptional. And as the aircraft was secured and later examined in detail, engineers documented the damage extensively, measuring the extent of structural loss, tracing the remaining load paths, and attempting to understand how the forces of flight had been redistributed in the absence of major stabilizing components. And what they found underscored how close the aircraft had come to failure, because the remaining structure had been operating well beyond its intended stress envelope, and small changes in speed or attitude could have led to collapse. And this understanding reframed the crew's experience not as a miraculous escape alone, but as a case study in near failure, where the margin between survival and destruction was razor thin. And this framing mattered because it influenced how the story was told within the service, not as encouragement to press damaged aircraft beyond reason, but as evidence of both the strengths and limits of the system. And the crew themselves experienced this reframing personally, because once the immediate relief wore off, the psychological impact of sustained exposure to danger set in, a delayed response common among air crews where the body's stress response receded and left behind exhaustion and reflection. And the realization that they had flown for an extended period in a condition that offered no safe options weighed heavily, because there had been no point at which they could relax or rely on procedure alone. And this recognition of vulnerability was not abstract. It was anchored in specific memories of control inputs, engine adjustments, and the constant fear that the next vibration might be the one that ended everything. And this internal experience mirrored a broader institutional reckoning, because the 12th Air Force was already reassessing its approach in the Mediterranean, grappling with losses that were unsustainable if repeated indefinitely. And the experience of this aircraft fed into that reassessment, not as a decisive turning point by itself, but as a vivid illustration of the risks involved. And as days passed, word of the incident spread through the unit, not as a sensational story, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something extraordinary. Because air crews were practical, accustomed to danger, and aware that survival often hinged on factors beyond their control. And yet, this case stood out, because it challenged assumptions about what constituted survivable damage, and pilots and crews discussed it in operational terms, considering what it meant for formation integrity, for decisions about when to break off, and for the judgment calls that pilots would have to make in future missions when faced with damaged aircraft. And these discussions were grounded in realism. Because no one mistook this survival for a guarantee, and the emphasis remained on preventing isolation, maintaining formation, and minimizing exposure. But the knowledge that an aircraft could remain controllable even after severe tail damage introduced complexity into decision-making, because it suggested that not all catastrophic-looking damage was immediately fatal, and that judgment in the air had to be flexible, responsive to actual aircraft behavior rather than assumptions alone. And this nuance was difficult to codify because it resisted simple rules. And that difficulty itself was a source of tension, because air warfare demanded procedures that could be taught, learned, and executed under stress, and exceptions complicated that process. And as the damaged B-17 was ultimately deemed beyond economical repair and struck off, its physical remains became less important than the lessons drawn from it, and the aircraft's nickname, All-American, gained symbolic weight, not as a boast, but as a shorthand for endurance under extreme conditions. And this symbolism was used cautiously, because the leadership was aware of the danger of turning exceptional survival into myth. And yet the story persisted because it resonated with the lived experience of crews who knew how quickly missions could unravel. And this resonance mattered as the air war intensified, because morale depended not on false confidence, but on a grounded belief that skill and discipline mattered even when plans failed. And this belief was tested repeatedly as operations continued, because the Mediterranean theater remained unforgiving, with long overwater flights, limited escort range, and determined opposition. And the memory of this flight hovered in the background, informing how pilots thought about damage, control, and the limits of their aircraft. And this influence was subtle, shaping attitudes rather than orders. But in war, such shifts in perception could have tangible effects because they influenced split-second decisions made under pressure. And as subsequent missions were flown, crews carried with them the knowledge that survival sometimes depended on holding together through prolonged uncertainty rather than dramatic action. And this knowledge aligned with the reality of air combat, where outcomes were often determined by endurance and judgment rather than singular acts. And in this sense, the flight represented a near failure, not because it almost crashed in a single moment, but because it existed for an extended period in a state where failure was constantly imminent, and the fact that it did not fail did not erase that proximity. And this proximity became a reference point, a reminder of how close the edge could be. And as the war progressed and aircraft, tactics, and escort capabilities improved, reducing some of the vulnerabilities that had defined early 1943, the memory of these early missions retained its relevance because they marked the period when American air forces were still learning, still paying for experience, and still discovering the limits of their tools. And the damaged B-17's flight fit squarely within that narrative, not as an outlier, but as an extreme example of the stresses involved. And the unresolved significance mentioned at the end of the flight took shape in this broader understanding, because it was not immediately clear whether the lesson to be drawn was optimism about aircraft resilience or caution about pushing damaged machines too far. And this ambiguity persisted, reflecting the complexity of the situation. And even as the crew returned to duty after rest, carrying with them the memory of the flight, the questions raised by their experience remained open because the air war was far from over, and future missions would present new challenges, and the margin between success and disaster would continue to be tested. And it was within this ongoing pressure, rather than in any single conclusion, that the true meaning of the flight would be determined, because the war would decide whether such endurance was an exception to be admired or a warning to be heeded.
And at this point, with the lessons still being debated and the campaign still unfolding, the story stood at its most precarious juncture, balanced between survival and the possibility that the next similar moment might not end the same way, with the outcome of what this experience would ultimately change still hanging unresolved, poised just before the final reckoning that would define its place in the history of the air war. And that final reckoning emerged not in a single announcement or doctrinal decree, but through the slow accumulation of operational change as the North African campaign moved toward its conclusion. Because by the spring of 1943, the strategic context that had produced the flight itself was shifting, with Axis forces in Tunisia increasingly compressed, their supply routes under sustained pressure from air and naval attacks, and American air units gaining experience at a cost that was steadily reshaping how missions were planned and flown. And within this evolving environment, the survival of the damaged B-17 found its proper place, not as an isolated marvel, but as one data point among many that informed a more cautious, more flexible understanding of bomber survivability. Because the engineers' final assessments confirmed that the aircraft's return had been possible only because specific load paths had remained intact by chance rather than by design, and that small variations in speed, turbulence, or control input could have produced a different outcome. And this conclusion reinforced an emerging consensus that while the B-17 was indeed robust, its resilience could not substitute for sound tactics, adequate escort, and disciplined formation flying. And as these conclusions filtered upward, they contributed to adjustments already underway, including more conservative decisions about when damaged aircraft should attempt to continue versus divert, clearer guidance to pilots about prioritizing controllability over mission completion when structural integrity was compromised, and an increased emphasis on engineering feedback from combat-damaged aircraft, because each return carried information that could not be obtained any other way. And at the same time, the symbolic power of the flight was carefully managed, because morale mattered, and the knowledge that an aircraft could survive such punishment offered reassurance to crews who faced daily risk. But leadership remained careful to frame the story in realistic terms, emphasizing judgment and restraint rather than invulnerability. And this balance was reflected in how the incident was recorded, analyzed, and remembered within the 12th Air Force, because it was treated as an example of exceptional endurance rather than a standard to emulate. And as the campaign progressed, the operational environment continued to change, because Allied fighter coverage improved, coordination between air and ground forces tightened, and the lessons learned in early 1943 were applied with increasing effectiveness, culminating in the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia.
In May 1943, an outcome that reduced the immediate pressure on Mediterranean air operations and allowed for a more deliberate integration of experience into training and doctrine. And in this broader arc, the flight that had continued after everything went wrong found resolution not through celebration alone, but through incorporation, its lessons absorbed into the collective understanding of what daylight bombing demanded. And for the crew themselves, this resolution was personal as well as institutional, because they returned to flying under conditions that were incrementally safer but never safe, carrying forward the memory of a mission that had tested their endurance and judgment to the limit. And while their survival did not grant immunity from future danger, it provided a reference point for how to respond when plans collapsed, reinforcing the value of steady control, measured decision-making, and an acceptance of uncertainty that defined effective aircrew behavior. And this behavioral legacy mattered as much as any technical insight, because air combat was ultimately conducted by individuals operating complex machines under extreme stress, and the ability to remain disciplined in prolonged crisis was a skill that could be cultivated through example,
And in this sense, the flight's impact extended beyond the immediate technical findings, shaping attitudes and expectations within units that continued to operate across the Mediterranean and later into Italy. And as the war moved on and newer aircraft, improved escort fighters, and refined tactics reduced some of the vulnerabilities that had characterized early missions, the memory of those initial experiences remained, because they marked the period when American air power was still proving itself, learning its limits, and adapting under fire. And the damaged B-17's return stood as a testament to that learning process, not because it promised survival, but because it demonstrated the consequences of perseverance combined with restraint. And when later historians examine the incident, they place it within this continuum, recognizing that its true significance lay not in defying physics, but in illuminating the narrow margins within which early daylight bombing operated, and how those margins were gradually widened through experience, analysis, and change. And so the flight story resolved not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet integration into the fabric of the air war, its outcome measured in improved understanding rather than immediate transformation. And as the aircraft itself faded into history, scrapped and replaced, the lessons it carried forward remained embedded in procedures, training, and collective memory, marking the moment when everything went wrong not as an endpoint, but as a catalyst for clear-eyed realism about the demands of modern air combat. And in that realism lay the true outcome of the flight, a grounded recognition of both the strength and the fragility of the systems on which the war in the air depended.